The night London learned to whisper was the night a name without a face began to move through the city like a foul fog, slipping under doors and settling into minds. Long before newspapers, hungry for sensation, would coin the phrase the Servant Girl Annihilator, the story truly began decades earlier, not in the grand squares of the aristocracy, but in the cramped, soot-stained warrens of the working class, where the Industrial Revolution's great roar was a constant, grinding backdrop. Here, gas lamps flickered like tired, jaundiced eyes over streets slick with coal dust and something worse. A small boy learned very early that silence could be louder than the screams from the gin palaces or the ceaseless clatter of the factories. His childhood unfolded in a narrow brick house pressed between a tannery and a match factory, a place where the walls absorbed not only arguments, but the perpetual stink of chemicals and damp, and the floors memorized the weary footsteps of his parents. His earliest memory was not of laughter or comfort, but of listening to his mother's shallow, rasping breath as she slept a sound common in the polluted air of the East End. Listening for his father's boots at the door, their sound signaling the end of another grueling 14-hour shift at the docks. Listening to the city itself, a vast hungry organism that never truly slept. He was born into a family where survival was the only routine. His father, a stern man shaped by long hours and little reward, saw affection as a weakness the world would exploit. His mother, worn thin by endless domestic labor and the loss of 2 infants before him, moved with a ghost-like resignation. Though no one would have described the boy as troubled, there was a stillness about him that made adults uneasy. He was always measuring the world, his eyes cataloging the cracks in the pavement, the brand of tobacco a man smoked, the subtle hierarchies of the street corner. School was a luxury, intermittent and brief. The family needed hands, not minds. Yet, in the few terms he attended, teachers noted his unnerving ability to remember details, the worn patch on a merchant's coat, the daily route of the baker's boy, the names and habits of people who never once looked at him. While other children fought for attention in the chaotic, overcrowded classrooms, he preferred the anonymity of corners and stairwells. He learned that people revealed their true selves in unguarded moments, a dropped parcel, a whispered word, a fleeting look of despair. His real education took place in the city's veins, the back alleys, the service entrances, the sprawling markets. He saw how respectable society ran on the unseen labor of the poor, how the grand houses of Bloomsbury and Mayfair depended on a hidden army of servants who were expected to be invisible. This realization planted a seed not of anger, but of fascination. When his mother finally succumbed to the consumption that haunted their neighborhood, the house grew quieter still. Grief, for him, was a silent, internal sealing off. His father, unable to bridge the chasm of silence between them, sent him to work. He became a porter, a messenger, and assistant roles that took him deep into the domestic machinery of the city. It was here he first truly noticed them, the servant girls. By the 1880s, they were the largest single workforce of women in the country, with nearly 1.6 million employed in domestic service. For a girl from the countryside, it was often the only path. Yet their lives were ones of grueling labor, often working over 80 hours a week for a meager wage. They had less fresh air than a factory worker, confined to the windowless basements and stuffy attics of the houses they served. He saw them as the city's true ghosts, present but unseen, essential but disposable. 1 in 3 women in London, between the ages of 15 and 24, was a domestic servant, a vast, transient population whose comings and goings were barely noted. His own anonymity became his craft. He was polite, reserved, utterly forgettable. Colleagues saw him as dull, a man without ambition or passion. They were unaware that behind his neutral expression was a mind constantly mapping the city's secrets, the delivery times, the unlocked scullery window, the household's routine, the master's travels. He saw how a girl's life could be erased without a ripple. Society's attention was a spotlight, and these girls lived permanently in the shadows. He learned that silence, when paired with the city's own indifference, was the ultimate tool. As years passed, his life settled into a pattern of extreme monastic order. His small room was sparse, his routines exact. He walked the same routes each evening, not aimlessly, but with the attentiveness of a watchman confirming his territory. There were no friends, no lovers, no conflicts. He had replaced emotional response with a cold, analytical distance. No crime had yet been committed, but the pressure was building behind a sealed door. Whispers eventually began, small, dismissible rumors of servant girls who vanished, said to have run off or returned home without notice. No one connected the disappearances. The city had taught itself not to look too closely at those it considered replaceable. And so, the first part of his story ends not with an act of violence, but with an atmosphere of preparation. It is the slow, methodical shaping of a man who had learned to move through the world without leaving footprints, while London, unaware and lost in its own self-important clamor, never suspected that its greatest threat was not a monster in the shadows, but an ordinary, invisible man who had blended perfectly into the crowd. In this city, being seen is a currency most people are desperate to earn. Me, I learned to be invisible. Not with a magic cloak or some sci-fi gadget, but with something far more potent, complete and utter mediocrity. My name is Arthur, and I am the ghost in this machine. My apartment is a study in beige. The furniture is functional. The walls are bare. The clothes in my closet are a sea of gray and brown. I don't own anything that screams for attention, nothing that tells a story. I am a blank slate. When I walk down the street, people's eyes slide right over me. I'm just another face in the crowd, the background character in a million different stories. It's an art form I've perfected over years. No sudden movements, no strong opinions, no memorable features. I am the human equivalent of white noise. This skill, this art of being overlooked, allows me to see the city for what it truly is. Not the glittering skyline or the bustling avenues, but the hidden gears and cogs that make it all turn. I drift through office lobbies, past security guards who don't register my presence. I sit in cafes, a silent observer, piecing together the invisible networks that hold this metropolis together. I study the flow of traffic, the delivery routes, the patterns of the sanitation workers. I see the city as a living organism, and I am its quiet, unseen biologist. My life is a routine of observation. I wake, I eat a simple breakfast, and then I step out into my laboratory. I follow a courier, just to see the chain of hands a single package passes through. I watch the intricate dance of chefs in a high-end restaurant kitchen from a forgotten corner table. I see the city's secrets, not the scandalous ones whispered in boardrooms, but the mundane, structural secrets that are far more revealing. I'm not a participant. I'm a function of the city's own indifference, a reflection of its blind spots. Then the disappearances started. It began quietly, a ripple in the city's undercurrent that only someone like me would notice. The first was Maria, a domestic worker from my building. One day, her cheerful morning greeting was just gone. Her employers posted a notice, a few neighbors asked questions for a day or two, and then nothing. The conversation moved on. A new cleaning lady was hired. The gears of the building kept turning, smoothing over the gap she left behind. It was as if she had never been there at all. I started paying closer attention. I used my invisibility to listen in, to drift through the communities where these women lived and worked. Another woman, Elena, who cleaned offices downtown, vanished. Then a third, Sophia, a nanny in a wealthy suburb. They were all like Maria, immigrants, domestic workers, people who existed in the margins of the city's consciousness. They were essential, yet invisible, long before they actually disappeared. The official narrative was simple, convenient. They had gone home, moved on, found better opportunities. The police reports were thin, filed away with a shrug. It was easier for everyone to accept these clean, simple stories than to confront the unsettling truth that people were vanishing from right under their noses. Society has a powerful immune system against uncomfortable truths. It prefers a comforting lie to a messy, frightening reality. I saw it firsthand. People wanted to believe everything was fine, so they did. But I knew the truth was different. My methodical mind, trained by years of dispassionate observation, saw a pattern. These weren't random events. This was a system at work, something deliberate and predatory, operating within the city's blind spots. The same blind spots I had learned to navigate. My invisibility, once a tool for passive observation, now felt like a responsibility. I began to compile my own data. I mapped the women's last known locations, their work schedules, the agencies that placed them. I gathered snippets of overheard conversations, security camera footage that no one else bothered to review, discarded notes. I was building a case in the shadows, creating a counter-narrative to the city's convenient fiction. My minimalist apartment transformed. The bare walls became covered in maps and timelines, connected by a web of strings. My quiet life was no longer about simple observation. It was about assembling a puzzle no one else even knew existed. I was still invisible, but I was no longer a detached observer. I had become the city's memory, the sole keeper of the stories of these forgotten women. They were not just data points on my map. Maria, who hummed folk songs while she polished the lobby floors. Elena, who always saved a piece of her lunch for a stray cat. Sophia, who showed pictures of her own children back home to anyone who would look. I was the only one left who seemed to remember them as people. My investigation led me to a high-end placement agency, Solutions Domestique. On the surface, it was pristine. A sleek office, smiling staff, glowing testimonials from wealthy clients. But using my particular set of skills, I slipped past the facade. I became the temporary janitor, the courier delivering a package, a man waiting for a bus just outside their door. I listened, I watched, and I discovered the horrific truth. The agency was a front. It wasn't just placing workers. It was trafficking them. When a client grew tired of an employee, or when a worker started asking for rights or better pay, the agency would solve the problem. The women weren't going home. They were being disappeared, sold on to worse situations, their identities erased, their existence scrubbed from the record. The city's preference for convenience and its inherent disregard for its most vulnerable populations had created the perfect hunting ground. The system wasn't just a few bad people. It was the apathy that allowed them to operate. The clients who didn't want to ask questions. The neighbors who preferred not to get involved. The authorities who found it easier to file a report than to investigate. I had the proof, the entire network mapped out. But who would I give it to? Who would listen to a ghost? For the first time in my life, I had to make a choice. I could remain invisible, safe in my anonymity, and let this horror continue. Or I could step into the light, become visible, and risk everything. The art I had perfected, the very thing that defined my existence, was now my biggest obstacle. To save the invisible, I had to make myself be seen. I compiled everything I had into a single, undeniable dossier. Every piece of evidence, every timeline, every name. But I didn't go to the police. The system was too compromised. Instead, I went to an independent journalist, a woman known for digging into the stories no one else would touch. I found her in a small, cluttered office, a kind of place that runs on coffee and conviction. I walked in, and for the first time in years, I made myself noticed. I met her gaze. I spoke. I introduced myself not as a function, but as a person. I laid the folder on her desk and told her everything. She looked at me, then at the mountain of evidence, her eyes widening with a mixture of horror and journalistic hunger. The truth, in all its uncomfortable detail, was finally in the hands of someone who would make it heard. The story broke a week later. It was an earthquake. Solutions Domestique was exposed, its founders arrested. The scandal implicated some of the city's wealthiest and most powerful figures. It forced a citywide reckoning with how it treats its unseen workforce. Investigations were launched, new laws were proposed. The convenient narrative was shattered, replaced by a brutal, undeniable truth. As for me, my anonymity was gone. My face was on the news, my name in the papers. I was no longer the ghost in the machine. People saw me now. They would nod on the street, some with gratitude, others with suspicion. It was strange, uncomfortable. But as I walked through the city, I noticed something else had changed. People were looking at each other a little differently. They were seeing the person stocking the shelves, the cleaner wiping the windows, the delivery driver rushing by. The invisible were becoming a little more visible. My life of quiet observation is over. I'm no longer just a function of the city's indifference. I am a participant. And I've learned that while there is a certain power in being invisible, the true power lies in choosing to be seen, especially when you're speaking for those who have no voice. The city is still a complex machine, full of shadows and secrets. But now, at least there's a little more light. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the hidden corners of our world. Stay curious and never stop looking closer. As the city's unease matured into something heavier, something that lingered even in daylight, his lifestyle adapted with the same quiet precision that had defined his rise into invisibility. Because fear, he understood, was not an obstacle but a variable, and like all variables, it could be measured, anticipated, and used. London no longer whispered but murmured, conversations pausing when unfamiliar footsteps approached, households revising routines without admitting why, servant girls walking in pairs or avoiding certain streets altogether. And though these shifts might have unsettled another man, they only sharpened his attention, because disruption revealed the seams of order, and he devoted himself to studying those seams, adjusting his movements not to evade notice, but to remain perfectly aligned with expectation. His living space became even more austere, not out of paranoia but efficiency, stripped of anything that could suggest personality, because personality created memory, and memory created connections, and connections were dangerous, while anonymity was armor. He altered his routes subtly, not dramatically, understanding that sudden change attracted scrutiny, whereas gradual evolution passed unnoticed, and he maintained an impeccable public presence, courteous, punctual, compliance so consistent that it disarmed suspicion through sheer predictability. Meanwhile, official attention intensified, though clumsily, as authorities struggled not with action, but with definition, because without witnesses, without spectacle, without a singular moment of outrage, there was no clear enemy to confront, only an accumulation of absences that resisted narrative cohesion. And he observed this struggle with detached interest, noting how investigations faltered when they lacked public pressure, how files accumulated dust as quickly as ink, how resources drifted toward louder crimes, leaving quiet disappearances suspended in bureaucratic limbo. Newspapers adopted increasingly cautious language, hinting at patterns while avoiding conclusions, and this hesitation fascinated him, because it demonstrated how truth could be diluted by uncertainty until it lost urgency altogether. Socially, his isolation deepened, yet it went unnoticed because isolation had become common, fear encouraging people to withdraw into familiar circles. And in this shrinking social landscape, a man who kept to himself appeared responsible rather than suspicious. His internal world grew colder, more abstract, as he began to think less in terms of individuals and more in terms of timing, flow, and probability, reducing human presence to movement within space, a conceptual shift that allowed him to remain calm even as the city's tension mounted. There were moments when he sensed proximity to exposure, not through evidence, but through intuition, the faint awareness that attention, however unfocused, was increasing, and during these moments he did not panic, but paused, suspending activity, allowing routines to settle, trusting that time itself would dissolve concern, because time, he believed, favored the forgetful. Authorities attempted coordination, sharing notes across districts, yet without a face, without a voice, without a single definable act to anchor their efforts. Momentum dissolved into meetings, and meetings into postponements, and he recognized this pattern as the city's greatest weakness, the inability to sustain focus without spectacle. His demeanor remained unchanged, which in itself became his greatest camouflage, because change invites comparison, and comparison invites memory, while consistency dissolves into background noise. At night he listened, not for sirens or footsteps, but for the city's rhythm, confirming that despite rumor life continued, commerce flowed, routines resumed, and this continuity reassured him, reinforcing his belief that systems corrected toward normalcy regardless of underlying threat. The phrase that would later define him began circulating more openly now, whispered in kitchens, and printed cautiously in headlines. Yet even as the name took shape, the man behind it remained undefined, because names, he understood, satisfied curiosity without delivering understanding, and understanding was the true danger. Part 3 closes in this state of compression, where pressure exists, but lacks direction, where awareness sharpens but fails to focus, and where he, perfectly synchronized with the city's habits, continues to move unnoticed within a society that has finally begun to look, but still does not know where to see. The end did not arrive with sirens or confrontation, because endings, he had long understood, were rarely dramatic. And as the city's attention slowly migrated elsewhere, drawn by louder scandals and more visible threats, the atmosphere that had once felt dense with suspicion began to thin, allowing routines to reclaim their authority. And in this return to normalcy, he sensed not victory but closure, the quiet conclusion of a cycle that had depended less on action and more on absence. Official efforts dwindled, files were archived rather than resolved, and discussions that once carried urgency softened into historical curiosity. And he observed this with neither pride nor regret, only recognition, because the system had behaved exactly as he had predicted, correcting toward forgetfulness once discomfort outweighed outrage. His own life narrowed rather than expanded, not due to fear but exhaustion, as if the sustained discipline required to remain unseen had slowly drained purpose from the process itself, and he began withdrawing from movement, limiting exposure, allowing himself to fade not into darkness, but into irrelevance. Neighbors changed, streets evolved, generations passed, and the city that once shaped him no longer resembled the one he had studied so carefully, which made anonymity easier, but significance harder, because anonymity without relevance is simply disappearance. And this realization marked the true end, not an arrest, not a revelation, but erosion. Whether he left the city, altered his identity, or simply aged into obscurity remains unknown, because no record demands resolution, and unanswered questions, he knew, linger longer than confirmed truths. What remained was a name detached from a face, a pattern without a culprit, a cautionary echo embedded in history rather than memory. And London continued forward, absorbing the story into its vast archive of unresolved moments, teaching future generations not through justice, but through implication. The true conclusion lies not in what became of him, but in what the city revealed about itself, because it was not cruelty that enabled the disappearances, nor secrecy alone, but indifference structured into daily life, a collective agreement to overlook those who served quietly and existed without voice. And so the suspenseful moral settles slowly, like fog at dawn. A society that measures human worth by visibility will always be vulnerable to losing those it refuses to see. And the most dangerous forces are not those that strike loudly, but those that move in perfect harmony with our neglect. The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe join Criminology, and step deeper into the dark with us.